In the late morning of August 12, 2000, the Russian nuclear submarine Kursk was conducting training exercises in the Barents Sea when a sudden detonation tore through the forward torpedo compartment. The blast measured the force of up to 250 kilograms of TNT. The front of the submarine was obliterated in an instant, with steel plating ripped apart, and crew in the immediate area killed instantly by the pressure and heat. 2 minutes later, a far more powerful secondary explosion followed. This second blast registered on seismic instruments and was strong enough to be detected across northern Europe. Sections of the 7-deck submarine crumpled under the impact. Bulkheads shattered, and compartments near the explosion became unreachable within seconds. The vessel lost buoyancy, then slammed to the seafloor at 108 meters depth. The midsection of the submarine was torn open, flooding rapidly under immense pressure. Seawater swept through ruptured compartments, extinguishing flames but also leaving bodies trapped beneath collapsed metal. Men stationed near the front were either killed outright by fire and shrapnel, or drowned before they could react. Survivors had only the rear compartments as refuge. Those who made it aft endured sudden darkness and the metallic taste of smoke drifting from the forward hull. Emergency systems failed almost immediately due to power loss. As the hull steadied in the silt of the seabed, temperatures dropped sharply with the surrounding Arctic water pressing in against weakened steel. The survivors began banging on the submarine's outer hull. The sound carried faintly through the water and was noted by nearby vessels hours later. However, no immediate action followed. Communication systems on board the Kursk had been destroyed. Signals could only be made by physical force, and these signals faded with time as conditions worsened. Within the sealed rear compartments, oxygen supply grew limited. Breathing became labored as carbon dioxide built steadily to dangerous levels. Rescue equipment was not on scene, and the men had no means to surface on their own. With the hull resting on the seabed and escape routes destroyed by fire and flooding, they remained trapped beneath 108 meters of frigid seawater. By nightfall, the once active submarine was silent. The distress from within was known, but the men still alive inside could not break free. The fate of the crew was sealed by the initial minutes of devastation and the delays that followed. In the hours after the explosions, Russian Naval Command initiated a rescue operation using surface ships and specialized submersibles. The first attempts began with miniature deep-sea vessels deployed from the rescue ship Mikhail Rudnitsky. These machines were intended to dock against the submarine's escape hatches and create a seal, but their outdated connections failed to align properly. Each descent consumed precious time, and the poor visibility of the Barents Sea made maneuvering difficult. Strong currents swept across the wreck site, pushing divers and equipment off course. Silt from the seabed reduced visibility to near zero, leaving operators reliant on touch rather than sight. The heavy pressure at 108 meters made human work exhausting and hazardous, limiting the duration of each dive. Attempts to clamp onto the Kursk's rear escape hatch repeatedly ended in failure as warped metal prevented a seal. Throughout August 13th and 14th, Russian command vessels attempted to maintain control of the operation, even as foreign navies offered advanced submersibles and divers. The offers were declined at first. This decision meant that highly specialized equipment from countries such as Norway and the United Kingdom remained idle while the situation deteriorated. It was not until August 16th that international teams were formally invited to join the mission. Communication among Russian ships and headquarters in Murmansk was plagued by delays and conflicting reports. At sea, commanders were not receiving consistent updates, and public statements from officials often obscured the severity of the situation. Families gathered on shore were given little precise information, adding further mistrust as the hours passed without progress. When foreign divers finally arrived, they brought advanced cutting tools and remotely operated vehicles capable of withstanding the harsh undersea environment. Even with this equipment, progress was slow. The escape hatch was found badly damaged, the seat distorted by the force of the explosion and subsequent buckling of the hull. No effective seal could be made, and continuous attempts over several days only confirmed that conditions had been worse than expected. By then, the thin margin of survival inside had already closed. The trapped men's ability to signal had ceased, and the buildup of carbon dioxide left little chance they remained alive. The delay in bringing suitable technology to the site meant that efforts became focused more on confirmation than rescue. For those coordinating the mission, the realization was stark. No one would be recovered alive. By August 14th, nearly 2 full days after the blasts, the last audible tapping from within the submarine faded. Naval monitors had registered faint signals of life from the aft section, but these ceased permanently that morning. From this point, no crew were left alive inside the Kursk. Subsequent recovery confirmed that 118 men had been lost, an entire submarine crew. Among them were 23 who had initially survived the explosions by retreating into the 9th compartment. They endured in the dark while oxygen reserves diminished and fires smoldered in adjacent sections. Water slowly encroached, filling the lower deck. The men trapped included both young conscripts and experienced officers, aged between 19 and 45. As the sealed compartment grew more saturated with smoke and rising levels of carbon dioxide, conditions became uninhabitable. Breathing grew increasingly difficult, and attempts to sustain life by gathering near the escape hatch failed once oxygen levels collapsed. When divers finally gained entry 2 weeks later, evidence of their final hours was found. Personal notes revealed how the group realized their situation was fatal. A letter written by Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov outlined that 23 men were confined together and described the progressive loss of light, power, and breathable air. He recorded their awareness that flooding was advancing through the vessel. The entire crew perished before effective rescue could reach them. In Murmansk and Vidyayevo, where most families were stationed, the loss struck with particular force. Both towns had long-standing ties to the Northern Fleet, and nearly every street and apartment block carried a direct connection to one of the men on board. The Kursk disaster occurred during what had been a scheduled naval training exercise. This fact only intensified the shock, as it meant the fleet's most capable vessel had been lost in peacetime conditions, along with the sailors considered among Russia's most skilled submarine personnel. The sinking of the Kursk removed 118 trained members from the Northern Fleet in a single incident. It was, and remains, one of the deadliest submarine accidents in post-war history, defined not only by the initial explosions, but by the inability to save those who survived them. The wreck itself was hazardous for anyone inside, and also for rescue operations above. The submarine's weapon storage still contained unstable torpedoes. Some had been damaged by the chain reaction, and naval engineers feared further detonation if salvage attempts disturbed them. This constant risk slowed recovery operations, with divers ordered to act cautiously around the forward sections where munitions remained. On the surface, the disaster moved into the political sphere. Russian officials delayed confirmation of the magnitude of the accident, releasing minimal information for several days. Television broadcasts provided vague statements, while international outlets reported seismic data suggesting an enormous explosion. This discrepancy fueled speculation that a cover-up was underway. Families of crew gathered at naval bases received conflicting information, often withheld until foreign governments had already announced details. Protests formed outside official buildings, challenging both the secrecy and the apparent reluctance to accept foreign help. The lack of clarity deepened mistrust in government accounts, and reports of misinformation circulated widely in Russian media. As days passed, scrutiny grew beyond the naval command structure. Questions were raised in the State Duma and in international press about the Ministry of Defense's response. The handling of information overshadowed early technical explanations of the disaster, shifting the event from a naval tragedy to a test of political accountability. Salvage teams, meanwhile, faced the ongoing threat of disturbance to unexploded armaments, a complication that meant recovery would be drawn out into the following year. The submarine Kursk was constructed in Severodvinsk and launched in 1994 as part of the Oscar II class of nuclear-powered guided missile submarines. It measured more than 150 meters in length and weighed nearly 19,000 tons when submerged. Its double-hulled design and thick steel plating allowed it to dive deeper than many Western submarines, while its primary role was to carry and launch long-range cruise missiles against naval targets. By the mid-1990s, Russia's economic crisis left the Navy struggling with declining budgets. Large vessels like the Kursk operated under reduced maintenance schedules, and spare parts often went unpurchased. Systems that required specialized inspection, including torpedo mechanisms and emergency hardware, received only partial attention. Nuclear-powered submarines remained a prestige symbol, yet their upkeep reflected the financial limits of the era. One long-standing issue involved the use of hydrogen peroxide as a propellant in certain torpedoes. These weapons offered high speed, but were prone to chemical instability if protective seals or storage conditions failed. International navies had largely abandoned this type of torpedo after several accidents in the mid-20th century, but the Russian fleet continued to rely on them. In 1999, reports surfaced stating that deterioration within the existing stock posed risks, though procurement of replacements was not authorized. Operational readiness further declined due to cutbacks in training. Routine safety drills were often shortened or omitted, leaving crews without consistent practice in dealing with fire, flooding, or weapons malfunctions. Rescue procedures also remained underdeveloped, since the operation of deep-sea escape vehicles was restricted by lack of funding for modern equipment. The fleet relied heavily on technology designed decades earlier, despite known limitations. Past submarine losses added weight to those concerns. In 1989, the Soviet submarine Komsomolets sank in the Norwegian Sea after a fire spread on board. Inadequate rescue capacity contributed to 42 deaths, despite the crew initially surviving the incident. This highlighted structural weaknesses in the Northern Fleet's preparedness for emergencies. Recommendations for improvements were made in the aftermath, but were not prioritized during the post-Soviet period of austerity. Despite these warnings, the Kursk continued to serve as a frontline asset. In August 2000, it was scheduled to participate in one of the largest naval exercises conducted by the Russian Federation since the end of the Cold War. The submarine entered the Barents Sea carrying live weapons, including the same unstable torpedoes that internal reports had flagged the year before. The immediate cause of the disaster was traced to a malfunctioning torpedo armed with the same dangerous high-test peroxide propellant. Investigators determined that hydrogen peroxide leaked from a degraded casing, decomposed, and ignited. This volatile reaction triggered the initial blast inside the forward compartment, setting off the chain of explosions that followed. The decision to continue using these torpedoes reflected institutional inertia more than technical ignorance. Within the Russian Navy, however, budget constraints and procurement delays meant existing arsenals remained in service well past recommended lifespans. Newer torpedoes designed to replace them had been produced in limited numbers, but not distributed widely enough to reach the Kursk. This reliance on outdated weaponry was compounded by reduced funding across the fleet after 1991. Routine inspections were often shortened, and materials for maintenance were rationed. Reports indicated that scheduled safety upgrades to weapons storage, detection systems, and emergency gear were postponed. The submarine's design offered formidable combat ability in theory, but survivability in peacetime accidents was not prioritized. Command structure also played a role in the scale of the tragedy. When the submarine failed to surface, distress recognition was slow. Available signals from nearby vessels suggested an emergency had occurred, yet headquarters initially treated the incident as a possible communication breakdown. This hesitation cost critical hours that could have been used to escalate rescue planning or involve foreign support before conditions inside became unsurvivable. The secrecy surrounding operations further restricted response. High-level officials delayed acknowledging both the magnitude of the explosions and the possibility of survivors trapped inside. Offers of international assistance were declined for nearly 4 days, even as Russian rescue tools struggled to attach to the submarine's degraded hatches. The priority placed on maintaining state security over rapid intervention extended the timeframe of the crisis. Rescue capabilities themselves reflected systemic neglect. The Navy's deep-sea submersibles were aging models that lacked reliable docking mechanisms. Their operators had limited training for real emergencies at depth, since exercises were constrained by economic limits. These factors meant that the equipment intended to save lives was ineffective when most needed. Taken together, the loss of the Kursk was not only a result of one torpedo's failure, but also the culmination of long-standing weaknesses. Weapon stockpiles, funding shortfalls, maintenance delays, command hesitation, and secrecy combined to ensure that what began as a contained accident became an uncontested disaster. On August 21, 2000, Norwegian divers confirmed that all 118 men aboard the submarine were dead. With no survivors left to save, the rescue shifted to recovery. Human remains were located in pockets of the wreck, but conditions made immediate removal unfeasible. In 2001, a large-scale salvage effort was launched to raise the submarine. The forward bow, which contained unstable torpedoes, was cut away on the seabed due to safety concerns. The rest of the great hull was lifted onto a barge and brought to Roslyakovo shipyard near Murmansk. Inside, divers and forensic specialists began the task of retrieving remains. From this operation, 23 bodies were recovered and later identified. DNA analysis was used in most cases, as extended submersion had obscured visual recognition. The remains were returned to families for burial, and state ceremonies were held to mark the scale of the loss. Families of the crew gathered in public vigils after the confirmation of death. Trauma spread through naval communities, where entire neighborhoods had known those aboard. Support groups formed informally, while officials issued compensation to next of kin in the months that followed. The Russian Navy established a commission of inquiry to determine the cause of the accident. Naval officers who had assisted in compiling the original technical analysis reported that many of their materials were classified and sealed from broader circulation. International observers pointed to how information only became widely available years later, once documents were declassified. Media coverage across 2000 and 2001 contrasted official silence with independent findings, amplifying questions of accountability. Reports in both Russian and Western outlets highlighted the disaster's link to insufficient maintenance, outdated weapons, and delayed rescue decisions. For the families, recovery did not end with the return of remains. Many survivors of the loss endured lasting psychological strain. Government aid softened immediate financial pressure, but long-term distrust toward official institutions persisted. The secrecy surrounding the full investigation ensured that unresolved questions remained well beyond the disaster's first anniversary. In the years following the Kursk disaster, the Russian Navy introduced significant reforms aimed at preventing a recurrence. Submersibles capable of deep-sea attachment were upgraded with modernized docking systems, while new rescue vehicles were acquired to replace aging hardware that had failed in 2000. Emergency equipment and oxygen supply systems were also re-engineered to withstand greater depths and prolonged isolation. Weapons handling procedures were revised with a focus on torpedo safety. High-test peroxide propulsion was phased out, and stricter inspection protocols were enacted for all stored munitions. Training now incorporated detailed simulations of onboard emergencies, with a greater emphasis on both firefighting and rapid evacuation planning. Internationally, the accident influenced broader naval standards. NATO nations undertook a re-evaluation of joint rescue capacity, improving coordination for submarine accidents at depth. Common protocols for hatch compatibility, communications, and shared deployment of rescue craft were developed to reduce delays in multinational responses. Joint exercises ensured that rescue resources could be mobilized quickly across borders. The memory of the crew remains tied to Murmansk, where a permanent memorial honors the 118 men who lost their lives. Unveiled in 2002, the structure is a gathering point for commemorations and a physical reminder of both sacrifice and the failures that prolonged the crisis. Annual ceremonies bring together families, officials, and naval personnel, reinforcing the local and national impact of the tragedy. Beyond its immediate reforms, the Kursk has continued to shape discussions on transparency and accountability in military institutions. Naval academies and safety programs worldwide include the case in studies of preparedness, equipment reliability, and the consequences of delayed decision-making. These lessons remain central to policies on both submarine safety and the management of large-scale emergencies. The loss of the Kursk demonstrated how preventable risks, when unaddressed, can escalate into irreversible disaster. While changes followed, the lessons drawn from the submarine's sinking remain a caution for any force that allows outdated technology, secrecy, or hesitation to stand between human lives and timely rescue. For more fascinating horror, hit the like button and subscribe.